This is the history of Rego Park. For many years, Rego Park had to live in the shadow of Forest Hills. It didn't even get its own post office until 1947 and library in 1951. Rego Park had no identity at all. We're going to show you a little bit of the rich cultural history of Rego Park, its homes, and its people.
Before the English, before the Dutch, there was the Native Americans, who many of us call Indians. They are Algonquin peoples. And it's an apocryphal story, but supposedly there were 12 separate tribes on Long Island, only 2,000 in all, none in Rego Park. Again, if Rego Park feels deprived of anything, it could start with the Indian tribes. The map that we have shown is interesting. It leads into a far shot of Forest Hills and Rego Park. Rego Park is in the upper right corner, above the tennis stadium, to the left of Queens Boulevard. And if you see nothing there, don't blink your eyes. It's Rego Park, because there was only farms in that direction. We now have Elwell Crescent, the jewel of Rego Park, in 1932. The first and only crescents to be developed within 10 years of the naming of the crescents itself. Here, there's only 2 or 3 houses. Next, we have another view of Rego Park. And here it is today, Elwell and 64th. Notice the sturdy Tudor houses, the Cape Cod houses. Pure civilization now. Now kids have other kids to play with. Wealthy. Beautiful area to live in. And now we have a view of Queens Boulevard. We think of Queens Boulevard as the post-1964 Queens Boulevard. You're looking at a 1924 Queens Boulevard, only 80 feet wide, facing westward towards Woodhaven Boulevard, with the Bolson family greenhouse on the left. It was here that the Bolson family had its real estate office, and after which Bolson Crescent is named. What does it look like today? As we see it today, it is a view of the Queens Center. Again, that Queens Boulevard, Woodhaven intersection. As we see it, overhead is the Long Island Expressway. Any historic community worthy of its salt must have historic houses. Ron, tell us about the Rego Park historic houses.
Well, that's interesting, Jeff, because we hear every day stories about Baum House, Queens Farm Museum, King's Mansion, but little do people know about the Robert Coe farmhouse. And this was a very, very historic house. Robert Coe had come to this country in 1624 from England and eventually had founded Newtown Village in 1652 and built a beautiful house which was at the corner of Queens Boulevard and 62nd Avenue. This house eventually was sold by his grandson, Samuel Coe, in 1695 to the Presbyterian Church, and they used it exclusively as a parsonage. It was sold to them along with 12 acres for the price of $375. And finally, in 1817, it passed into private hands. And curiously, Jeff, this house and its property eventually became the nucleus of Rego Park Homes. This was the property that was eventually sold and first developed in the Rego Park area. Another house worth mentioning that was very popular in the area was the Joseph Werschling Halfway House. This was originally on Queens Boulevard, the north side of Queens Boulevard. It was approximately 800 feet east of the intersection of Woodhaven Boulevard and Queens Boulevard. As you can see in the picture, there are 2 houses. The one on the left is the original halfway house, and the one on the right is the newer one built in the 1850s. This was very popular because in those days, when you would make a trip from Jamaica to Long Island City and back, your horses would have to rest for the night and you'd have to stay somewhere. And this was a very popular resort at that time for the travelers. Another house that stood on the south side, a few hundred feet down, was the Marie Covert House. Seen here in this photo in its last days in 1924, it stood at the corner of 63rd Avenue and Queens Boulevard. This house, you'll notice to the left, has an extension on it. This extension was put on the house many years afterwards. In the early days, instead of moving to Long Island, what they did at this time is you would have an extension put on your house. That would be a sign of wealth and prosperity, and to show people that you were making it, so to speak.
Why were there so few houses, Ron, in this area, even in the 1700s?
Well, most of the people at that time were farmers, and they were very protective of their property and their acreage. And in those days, the more acres you had, the more crops that you could grow, and the more money that you could bring from market. So the bulk of the area was just controlled by just a handful of people. And that brings me to J.J. Tompkins. We're looking at the J.J. Tompkins farmhouse, which was shown here in its last days in 1924. The porch has already collapsed, and it had a long life. It was originally built in 1760 by Thomas Waldron. And Tompkins was a pretty prosperous man of the Rego Park area. He had 27 acres. He grew corn, lettuce, cabbage, and rhubarb, which was sold in Manhattan. And the house, which you can't tell from the picture, stood on Elwell Crescent, south of Carlton Street, and was demolished shortly after this photo was taken.
How sad it is that so many of the old houses were lost, Ron, at this particular time, including the Remsen house.
Yeah, that's interesting because today we spend hundreds of dollars traveling, or even thousands traveling to different parts of the country to look at old houses in New England, and we had them right here in Queens. But in the name of progress and prosperity, we've lost quite a bit of our history. And this brings us to the Frederick Saunders house. This was a very beautiful, expensive house on a large plot of land, 80 by 100. Very first house built on Saunders Street. Beautiful colonial, made of spruce, had parquet floors in every room, had a real wood-burning fireplace, all the comforts of home. And Reverend Saunders had passed away, and his widow, Belle Saunders, who was a teacher at PS 101 in Forest Hills, the house became too much for her. The cost of property on Saunders Street skyrocketed. 1940. Enter Harry Lefrak.
Right.
Made her an offer she couldn't refuse, gave her a generous price, not so much for the house, but the property that the house stood on. And this beautiful house was torn down, and in its place was constructed the Tennessee Apartments that stand in its place.
What price progress to lose a beautiful house? But you're also relieving the pressure on the inner city, aren't you, Ron, of many people?
That's true. That's true. And Belle Saunders lived out her life in an apartment house. The house was too much probably for her anyway to keep up. We're going to fast forward now to 1925. In 1924, Queens Boulevard was widened to its 200-foot width that we're accustomed to today. And the Robert Coe homestead was thoughtfully moved up to Saunders, a little bit up off Queens Boulevard. They didn't want to tear it down just yet. At that time, the new Rego Park homes were going up, the very first Rego Park homes. How could they sell these houses without a sales house? What did they do? They took the Robert Coe homestead and they converted it, and we have a shot of it here. They whitewashed it, they put a sign on it, Rego Homes, $7,500.
You know, Ron, one of the most interesting stories is how Rego Park got its name. Schloe was a German immigrant. He never lost his German accent. And so when he was selling Rego Park, he would, first of all, did not name his community. But gradually, as he was talking to people, prospective buyers, he would say to them, I have some real good property here. Real good, real good, real good. And slowly the RE and the real and the GO and the good formed a new word for him. Rego. Rego Park. And that's how the community did get its name. And Schloe was definitely proud of his particular area. He sold it. He built his own railroad station. God knows where he got the money from. He built a gas station on the property. He donated land for churches. This was Schloe. Very interesting individual, Ron.
After Schloe built all these houses, what was the next thing he needed?
He needed a school, certainly, for the kids who were going to be born into the development.
And they got it. In 1929, they named it PS 139. And they were very civic-minded people. They had a big celebration. They marched up and down the streets. They had a lot of speakers out that day. It was really an event. In those days, they really did even the simplest things up to the hilt. But Rego Park did not get its own library until 1951. So they would have to use the facilities of Forest Hills or Elmhurst or Corona or their own school library. And it wasn't until 51 that they did get a library, and at that time it was quite inadequate, even for 1951 standards. It was very small on 63rd Drive, right under the LIE trestle. And it's interesting because right next door was a tavern, a bar and grill, which had burnt down in 1960. They extended it, they took over the tavern, and still it was quite a small library for that community. And they say lightning doesn't strike twice, but in this case it did. It had a second fire, and the entire block this time, that entire square block was wiped out in a fire in the early 1970s, and as a result they moved the library across the street where the old Shell gas station was, and Rego Park finally in 1974 got the library that it always deserved, a big sturdy brick building that could accommodate the large growing community. You know, by the way, the library, the very first library, as small and as cramped as it was, when the newspapers first boasted of it, they emphasized it was the first branch of the Queensboro Public Library to have fluorescent lighting.
Actually, we have a photo here in 1940 of the shopping center of Rego Park, which was Elliott Avenue. Elliott Avenue from Saunders to Queens Boulevard was the shopping area. Small stores, a luncheonette, law office, barber shop. It was quite a small, almost hometown type of atmosphere at this time. But all of this came to naught because in the mid-1950s, again I use the word Robert Moses, you had the development of what would later be called the Long Island Expressway. The Long Island Expressway came through this particular development, knocked off a great deal of Saunders Street between Elliott and Woodhaven Boulevard, and completely dominated that part of the neighborhood. The people left en masse. Some of them moved south, some of them moved to the other side of Elliott Avenue. And what we see today is basically the relics of that particular area.
That's interesting because 63rd Drive, which eventually did become the major artery and the major shopping center, was homes. There were private homes, 40 by 100 homes on 63rd Drive. 63rd Drive was never planned as the business district. Elliott Avenue had that distinction, but the LIE...
The old-timers will tell you, Ron,